Mark stood in the hallway, his fingers tracing the edge of the heavy white envelope in his hand. The office air felt thin, recycled through vents that hadn't been cleaned in years. He watched the digital clock on the wall click over to 9:02 a.m. This was the moment. He walked toward the corner office, his boots clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. He didn't knock. He pushed the mahogany door open and stepped inside. Bill was hunched over his desk, 3 monitors glowing against his face. He was shouting into a headset about a merger in Ohio, his face a deep shade of red. He held up a finger, signaling Mark to wait. Mark didn't sit in the leather chair. He stood by the window, looking down at the tiny cars crawling through the city streets below. 5 minutes passed. Bill finally slammed his fist on the desk, disconnected the call, and ripped the headset off. He looked at Mark and demanded to know why the logistics report wasn't in his inbox by midnight. Mark didn't answer. He walked over to the desk, leaned across the expensive glass surface, and dropped the envelope directly onto Bill's keyboard. Bill stared at it for a moment, then back at Mark. He asked what kind of game this was. Mark spoke clearly, his voice devoid of the usual hesitation. He told Bill that it wasn't a game, it was his life, and he was taking it back. He said he was resigning, effective immediately. Bill's eyes widened. He stood up, leaning over the desk to match Mark's height. He called Mark ungrateful. He reminded him of the company car, the country club membership, and the 2 decades of seniority. He told Mark that at 53 he was too old to be starting over and too young to retire. He warned him that if he walked out now, there would be no golden parachute, no consulting fees, and no way back in. Mark listened to the entire rant without blinking. When Bill finally ran out of breath, Mark told him that those 20 years felt like a prison sentence, and he had just served his time. Mark turned and walked out. He went to his cubicle, which he had already cleared out the night before. All that was left was a small cardboard box filled with a few personal photos and his favorite stapler. He picked it up and headed for the elevators. On the way, he passed the break room. Sarah, the head of accounting, was pouring coffee. She asked if he was headed to the meeting. Mark told her he was headed to the rest of his life. He didn't wait for her reaction. He stepped into the elevator, pressed G, and watched the lights of the office floors disappear one by one. In the parking garage, the air was cool and smelled of exhaust. Mark reached his truck, threw the box into the back seat, and sat behind the wheel. He didn't start the engine. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his company smartphone, and laid it on the passenger seat. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to melt. He started the truck, the V8 engine roaring to life, and drove toward the exit. He didn't look in the rearview mirror as he cleared the gate. The drive out of the city took longer than usual due to a stalled delivery truck on the bridge, but Mark didn't mind. For the first time in years, he wasn't checking his watch every 30 seconds. He turned on the radio to a classic rock station and let the music fill the cab. He drove past the suburbs, past the shopping malls, and into the open stretches of farmland. He pulled into a small dusty diner called the Rusty Spoon. It was a place he had passed 100 times on business trips, but never had the time to stop. He sat at the counter and ordered a double cheeseburger and a tall glass of iced tea. The man sitting 2 stools down was wearing overalls and a trucker hat. They talked for 20 minutes about the weather and the price of hay. There was no talk of market shares, quarterly growth, or corporate synergy. It was the most honest conversation Mark had held in a decade. When the bill came, Mark paid in cash and left a generous tip. He felt a strange sense of power in using physical money instead of a corporate credit card. He reached his house at 2:30 p.m. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound being a distant lawnmower. He saw Linda in the backyard, wearing her gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. She was kneeling in the dirt, tending to her roses. Mark walked around the side of the house and stood by the patio. Linda looked up, startled. She wiped a smudge of dirt from her forehead and asked if the office had lost power. Mark sat down on the stone wall and told her that he had walked out. Linda didn't scream or panic. She stood up slowly, took off her gloves, and sat down next to him. She asked if he was okay. Mark told her he felt like he had just been released from a dark room into the sunlight. He described the look on Bill's face and the silence of the elevator. Linda reached over and took his hand. She told him that she had watched him turn into a ghost over the last few years, and that she was glad he was finally home. They sat there for a long time, just listening to the wind in the trees. Mark went inside and changed into an old pair of jeans and a faded t-shirt. He went to the garage and started organizing his fishing tackle. He found his father's old fly rod and spent an hour cleaning the reel. He felt the weight of the graphite in his hand and remembered the trips they used to take to the mountains. He told Linda they were leaving that afternoon for the cabin. He didn't want to spend another night in the city. He wanted to sleep where the only noise was the water hitting the shore. They packed the truck with a cooler, a few changes of clothes, and a bag of charcoal. As they were pulling out of the driveway, the neighbor, Larry, waved from his porch. He looked confused to see Mark home so early and dressed so casually. Mark just tipped his hat and kept driving. He felt like he was escaping, not from a job, but from a version of himself that he no longer recognized. He turned onto the state highway, the sun setting behind the hills in front of them. The cabin was located at the end of a long gravel road that wound through a thick forest of pine and oak. By the time they arrived, the moon was reflecting off the surface of the lake. Mark unlocked the door and flipped the light switch. The cabin smelled of cedar and old books. He built a fire in the hearth while Linda unpacked the groceries. They sat on the floor in front of the fire, eating sandwiches and drinking beer from the bottle. There was no television, no internet, and no humming of a computer. Mark woke up the next morning without the aid of an alarm. The room was cold, so he pulled the wool blanket tighter around him and watched the light filter through the curtains. He stayed in bed until 1000 a.m., something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. When he finally got up, he made a pot of strong coffee and walked out onto the dock. The lake was covered in a thick layer of mist. He sat on the edge of the dock, his feet dangling over the water, and watched a bald eagle circle high above. He spent the afternoon working on the cabin's porch. A few of the boards had rotted over the winter, and he took a quiet satisfaction in the physical labor. He measured, sawed, and hammered. He enjoyed the feeling of sawdust on his skin and the ache in his muscles. It was a different kind of tired than the mental exhaustion he felt at the office. This was a productive tired, a feeling of actually having accomplished something tangible. Linda sat nearby, reading a book and occasionally bringing him a glass of cold water. As the sun began to set on their second day, Mark took the small rowboat out to the middle of the lake. He didn't bring his fishing rod this time. He just sat in the middle of the boat and let it drift. He thought about Bill in the office. He wondered who was sitting in his chair and who was answering the phones. He realized with a start that it didn't matter. The company would keep moving, the meetings would keep happening, and the world would keep turning without him. He wasn't the indispensable piece of machinery he thought he was, and that was the most liberating thought of all. He rowed back to shore as the first stars began to appear. He walked up to the cabin and saw Linda standing in the doorway, the light from the fireplace glowing behind her. He realized that for 20 years he had been chasing a ghost, trying to build a future that he was too busy to ever actually enjoy. He walked up the steps, took Linda's hand, and went inside. He closed the door behind him and locked it, not to keep the world out, but to keep his new life in. That night, Mark slept better than he had in decades. He didn't dream of spreadsheets or angry clients. He dreamt of the sound of the oars hitting the water and the smell of the pine trees. He knew there would be challenges ahead, and he knew they would have to be careful with their spending. But as he listened to the steady breathing of his wife beside him, he knew he had made the right choice. He had walked away from the noise and found the silence, and in that silence, he had finally found himself.